This is called How to Choose an Aff, and this is the first time I've done this. My goal is to give you all of my secrets, and I don't think that they really are secrets because you could figure them out from publicly available information. But I've compiled my thoughts about choosing an aff and about what goes into that and which specific affs I think make more sense than others in a much more systematic way than I ever have before, at least in a way that I've presented to others that are not on my own team. And so I think that you will find this quite valuable. I spend a lot of time thinking about affs, and I enjoy coaching debate, all kinds of debate, but I am most interested in coaching the aff. And the reason I like being aff and coaching the aff is because it feels to me like the ultimate test. The aff has to prepare a position and then defend it over the course of a season against opponents that are highly motivated to attack it and figure out what's wrong with it. And I think that's really fun. In the past few years, and in many of the years, which I'll talk about, we've only read one aff all year. And I really like that because I think when the negative is really well prepared, we get a tough challenge, and then when we win, it's very rewarding. When we lose, it gives us important feedback that we can use to win the next time. And I just think it's more fun that way. I also like coaching the negative, but kind of for the opposite reason. Can we figure out as a negative team how to defeat a really well-prepared affirmative that is trying to defend their position over the course of the year? The reason I like coaching the aff better is that many aff teams don't think about being aff as systematically as I do. And so sometimes they don't invite us to compete in the same way or to be at our best or to be as thoughtful. And so coaching the neg in those spots I don't find as much fun or as much of a challenge. None of that is directly relevant to all of the rest of the stuff that I'm saying, but I thought that it was appropriate to tell you kind of where I'm coming from before I begin. You don't have to share that opinion. You don't have to share my preferences, but I think the track record of me as an affirmative coach is quite good. I think it speaks for itself. And I would like it if more teams were good at being affirmative, because I think that debate is better when the affirmative is better. And so selfishly, I would like it if more people were good on the aff, because then coaching negative is more interesting and enjoyable. One very important caveat before I begin: your coach is your boss. If your coach decides your aff, that's the aff you will read. I still think this lecture will be quite valuable for you. I think it'll help you understand how they are probably making the decision about what aff you will read. I also think understanding how to choose an aff strategically is ultimately about understanding how to be strategic on the affirmative. And I think that's useful for everyone, even if the aff that you read is selected for you. This lecture is divided into 5 sections. The first section is my overall philosophy about choosing an aff. The second section is the basic choices you must make and how to think about them. The third section is the essential qualities for a good aff or of a good aff. The fourth section is how to formalize the aff selection process. The fifth section is how I've chosen affs on previous topics and what I think of those decisions in retrospect. And the sixth section is what to do after you've decided your aff. This is going to be relatively fast because I have a lot to say and only limited time. Please save your questions until the end, and if there's time available, I will answer them. So Roman numeral number 1, my overall philosophy about choosing an aff. Overall philosophy about choosing an aff. I have 3 points. Point number 1. The basic question you have to answer is, what kind of debates do you want to have? What kind of debates do you want to have? You will learn the most about your aff, and you will spend the most time on your aff of everything you study during the course of a year. You should not choose something that you are not interested in studying, even if it is slightly more strategic, because motivating yourself to be invested in the aff and to be interested in it will cause you to do more work and to care more and to do some of the things that you wouldn't do if you were not enjoying it. So at the margins, I do think, is this something you're interested in talking about and spending your time learning, is an important consideration. At the same time, though, don't choose something that's good or interesting or sounds like fun but isn't strategic. Because even if it sounds interesting and fun and whatever in the here and now, when it starts losing, it takes all of the fun out of it. And so if you choose an unstrategic aff because you think this is an interesting topic, or you're interested in the impact, or you just don't really have a good reason, it stops being fun as soon as the losing starts. Point number 2, it's the most important decision you make. It's the most important decision you make. It affects half your debates. None of your negative arguments affect half your debates. They affect a fraction of half of your debates. Being very ready on the aff is therefore better than being very ready on the neg if there's some trade-off. So it's better to be super ready on the aff and slightly less ready on the neg than super ready on the neg and slightly less ready on the aff, just mathematically. Also, I think in terms of just quality of life, being confident in being aff makes debate tournaments a lot more fun. If you rely on only being neg, and you really don't want to be aff, and you feel very defensive and vulnerable when you're aff, Debate tournaments are terrible because the prelims are terrible, but even if you can make it to the elims, the coin flip is just so important. Because if you don't win the flip, or if the other team decides that they would like to be negative, you feel terrible and you just don't feel in a position to win. If you feel like you can always be aff and you're good with that, it's amazing how much less stressful elimination rounds are. Because a lot of teams want to be negative. And if you're fine with that, then who cares about the coin flip? Number 3, nonetheless, do your negative preparation first. Nonetheless, do your negative preparation first. This is counterintuitive, but I think it is essential, and it's something that we've started doing in the last few years that I think has made a big difference. Doing your negative preparation gives you a sense of which affs are strategic. It is not possible to have an effective sense of what are the most strategic affs if you do not understand the topic and what the negative will say. Good negative teams will be preparing the same way you are to be negative, and so you need to understand that process so that you can then choose the aff that you think is most strategic, given what the negative is likely preparing for. I will explain preparation for the first tournament in a separate session in HSS. I think I will record it. I have never recorded it before, and so I'll throw that up on my YouTube channel, but I'm not going to go into more detail about that here. But the bottom line is, deciding an aff before you figure out the neg doesn't make any sense, because figuring out the neg tells you what kind of aff is good and what kind of aff is bad. So you have to be thinking about the aff with the negative in mind. You can't decide if the aff is good without knowing the neg. Roman numeral number 2, the basic choices you must make and how to think about them. Basic choices you must make and how to think about them. I'll highlight 5 choices. The first choice, small or big. Small or big. The case for small is that, or the intention is that it can catch the negative off guard. It can make it so that the negative has nothing to say or nothing good to say. And it can provide a small literature base, small set of evidence or set of articles about the issue, so that you can read everything and know everything about the issue. Big affs, on the other hand, give the negative predictable responses. They usually make sure the neg is good enough that the neg might want to actually go for those arguments and talk about the aff. And there is, in contrast to the small aff, there's a more robust and alive or evolving literature base that allows you to constantly be developing your argument. I tend to think, in most spots, that bigger is better, and I think that this is a fault line in aff choice. The philosophy of the small aff is to try to give the neg nothing good to say, and I understand that instinct. But I think that practically, it's often self-defeating. The negative, of course, still has to say something. I've yet to see a negative, when confronted with a small aff, concede. Because they have to say something, they say a variety of terrible things. And the variety of terrible things that they say are also extremely hard to predict, because each team has its own set of terrible things. And so your whole season is spent playing whack-a-mole against things that are hard to predict and that are bad. If you enjoy that, sign yourself up. But because you have a hard time predicting, there's less of a direct relationship between how hard you work and how well prepared you are and how well you do in your debates. Big affs have more of a direct correlation. The more you study, the more you learn, the more cards you cut, the more you refine your arguments, the more successful you will be, because the negative is much more likely to say the arguments that you are prepared for. With a small aff, being really great on your case might not help at all. And so really, you just need to spend the year specializing in getting good at Baudrillard, or the consult counterplan of the week, or the politics DA of the week, or whatever. And so I think bigger is usually better. Point number 2, camp aff or something new. Camp aff or something new. The case for a camp aff is quite simple. Unless a lot of people, really smart people, have really failed, the best affs should have already been written. That doesn't mean they were written perfectly, but it does mean the best ideas have usually been uncovered. The other benefit of a camp aff is that you know a lot more about what the negative is likely to say, because there are camp negatives, and teams will use those camp negatives. Not just that they'll use them, but those are also representative of the arguments in the literature, so people who are working on negatives will come up with those arguments. The case for something new is that early in the year, others won't be as well prepared. It might be better than what people wrote at camp because you know more about the topic now, and maybe there was something that you figured out about neg generics that will allow you to write an aff now that you couldn't have done at the beginning of camp or during camp. One thing you have to worry about is that if you're the only team reading this aff, then you don't get the benefits of scouting, finding out what other teams read against this aff. The other benefit that you forego with a new aff is open source neg. So when there's no neg, many teams will just say unpredictable things. against a camp aff, when there's kind of a shared open source neg, most of the teams will say the same thing. That's how they research. They find what is available in camp evidence or what other teams have read. And so you have a better chance of identifying the arguments that are likely your way. I kind of think the middle ground is best. I think you should adapt a camp affirmative and add a tweak or a twist. Try to make it more strategic and better now that you know more about how the negative side of the topic has evolved. So you take negative camp arguments and you try to make aff arguments and adapt the aff to better position yourself against them. Not to take away those arguments, but just have a better angle against them. The sweet spot is often close enough that the neg won't dedicate specific energy to it, but different enough that their camp files won't beat it. Or at least will not beat it without really strong execution. Choice number 3, one aff or multiple affs. The case for one is that you're best prepared then, you're most experienced, you get a lot of repetitions, and you have the most scouting information, especially if you're on a team with several other pairs, like a school with several teams. The case for multiple is that it allows you to tailor your aff to opponents or judges. Breaking new affs has strategic benefits in the round, and it also reduces incentives for negative prep. And that can be strategic if that's your stylistic preference. You also have to choose whether you want to have one aff that you read in all debates or an aff that you read mostly against policy-making opponents and an aff that you read more against critical theory opponents. I do think you should have different versions. I often think different versions of the same aff is the best solution because you know the most about the aff that then you're reading in every debate. And knowing your aff is extremely important in critique debates. It allows you to be more flexible without giving up all the things that you have learned and foregoing that benefit. But sometimes a different aff makes sense. This can be a aff against a particular K or against Ks in general. If there's a really great angle against a particular K team, especially if that's one of your rivals, go ahead and take advantage of that. Write an aff just against that team. Against K affs that don't ever read T, you can often push the limits on whether your plan that you're defending is topical. That's why it's so valuable for negatives to be flexible. The aff can't over-adapt against a flexible opponent. And that's also why I think in general, different versions, tweaked versions of the same aff is the best blueprint to balance versus policy or versus K. Choice number 4 is permanent or temporary. I mean, should you have an aff that's permanent or just an aff that you're writing temporarily? This is mostly the same as one or multiple, but it's slightly different. So the case for a permanent aff is similar to the case for one aff, which is it requires the aff to be better. It means that you're spending the entire year working on one aff. Every iteration that you have of that aff makes you better at that aff. Every little bit of work that you do all year is dedicated to the aff that you are going to debate at the end of the year. And so it accumulates experience and in a way that makes you a lot better by the end of the year. The case for temporary is that it can allow better tailoring to opponents. It allows slightly worse affs to be successful. So often the way this works is that you have an aff that kind of relies on an interesting angle against the negatives strategy. It's not immediately answerable, but with some work, the negative will figure it out and answer it. And so maybe you just kind of need to read that one temporarily and then you have another one ready to go in the next month. But you need to be very careful about this because I think a lot of students talk themselves into this and kind of what they say to themselves is I'll just read this kind of bad aff temporarily. And then that becomes, I'll just keep reading this a little longer, and then pretty soon you've spent half your season reading what is obviously a bad aff. And then going along with that, you often convince yourself they're not going to figure it out, it'll be fine, they're not that smart, they'll probably just go for the K. But that's usually wrong, and it's especially wrong when you have to debate a smart opponent, and then all of a sudden, boom, they figured it out and you lost because you had accepted the lower standard of affirmative. I think that's why it's better, in general, to write affirmatives that you think have some permanence that are survivor affs, not just temporary throwaway affs. Last point, number 5. Very topical or not so much. Very topical or not so much. Very topical affs are great because topicality is a leveler. If you're a really good team especially, I think you should read a very topical aff because it's harder for a good team to control topicality debates than disadvantage debates or counterplan debates or critique debates. Reading a very topical aff removes that problem. You can't ever stop the negative from going for T, but you can make it a lot less frequent and a lot less threatening, especially when you're debating an opponent that is below you in the pecking order, that really in an evenly, out of 100 times, you're going to beat them 80 times or 90 times. You want to read a very topical aff because topicality makes the win probability much closer. You could read a moderately topical aff because sometimes pushing the limits on T a little bit is what allows you to have a better angle against neg generics. That makes you more vulnerable to topicality, but you might be okay with that. If you feel like you can win those T debates, it might be worth the risk. Not particularly topical affs. Sometimes those can take away neg generics, and so they're likely to go for T. So if you want to debate T, that might be okay with you. That might be the debate that you want. Some teams will still take you up on the case, though, and so you still have to be prepared to defend the aff, but just it won't be as often. The teams that tend to like these affs are teams that don't like the research and the preparation as much, but love the more games playing part of debate. Because reading these types of affs turns a lot of debates into the kind of gaming debates about topicality, or similar to reading just a small f in general, debates where the negative is kind of making stuff up and the affirmative is dealing with it. I don't tend to like these, but some people do, and I understand why. Finally, affs that just aren't topical at all on purpose. I don't suggest this. I don't think it invites good debates. I think it's much more strategic, just empirically. If you want to read a KF, to read one with a topical plan. As a negative coach, I found it much more difficult to debate teams that have a topical plan and then critique something. There was an MBA team that I thought was extremely hard to debate because they read a KF with a plan. They were much easier to defeat when they didn't read their plan. On this topic, I feel like that's especially true. You can topically just ban arms sales and then critique militarism. That seems like a tough aff to defeat. I don't understand why you would give the negative framework when you don't have to. But the primary reason teams do choose not to read a topical plan is that means that there's a lot of neg predictability. Mostly they'll be debating T and framework. Mostly they'll be debating a few generic Ks, the capitalism critique, maybe psychoanalysis, maybe something else. But there's a relatively limited set of things that can be said. If that's what you want to debate, then that's the way to achieve that. But I'm not going to talk about that. Roman numeral number 3, the essential qualities of a good aff. The essential qualities of a good aff. I have 6 points in this section. First, it is strong against the core counterplan or counterplans. Strong against the core counterplan or counterplans. These are in order, by the way. Many people write affs to have good advantages that beat the status quo. I think that is completely nonsensical unless you debate in an area where the negative mostly defends the status quo. In most areas, including the national circuit, the neg almost never defends the status quo. They defend counterplans or critiques. So, your entire process of writing an aff needs to be directed at defeating counterplans. You should identify the core counterplan, or a few, depending on the topic, there's one or more, that affs must defeat in order to win. On this topic, it's a leverage counterplan or a reform counterplan. So it's a counterplan that either uses the threat of taking away arms to motivate change, or it's a counterplan that reforms the arms sales process but doesn't end it. Therefore, you need an advantage that can defeat these counterplans that is intrinsic to ending the sales, not just reforming them, not just threatening to end them. There are many affs with good advantages on every topic, but there are very few affs on any topic that can defeat the core counterplan, and those are the best affs. And if you're not reading one of those affs, then you're reading a bad aff. I don't care how good your advantage is. Point number 2, it is strong against the core DAs. DA or DAs, depending on the topic. This doesn't necessarily mean that the DA doesn't link to the aff. It could mean that, but it often doesn't. More often it means that good affs beat the core DAs at multiple levels. They beat the link, they have a good link turn, they access the impact, they outweigh the impact. They have a good angle against the core disad. On this topic, I think defense industrial base and supplier shift DAs, that genre of DAs, is a core DA. Your aff needs to have an angle for defeating it. I think relations and influence style DAs, those are more country specific. But that DA, that you're going to hurt relations with the country and you're going to undermine American influence with that country, I think that's a core DA. And I think the deterrence DA, or the whatever the arms are being used for DA. So again, that's somewhat dependent on the specific case. But as you're vetting, we'll talk about how to vet in a later part. Those are the DAs that I think you need to have in mind. You need to be able to defeat those DAs. Politics DAs, the election DA, those are relevant, but I don't think those are as important. I think there are ways to get angles against those that don't require any particular aff. Number 3, it has intrinsic advantages. Intrinsic. Intrinsic means the plan is necessary and sufficient to solve them. The more intrinsic the advantage, the more difficult it is to defeat with case arguments or counterplans. This is the thing I spend the most time on, and I think it is, if I'm reflecting, it's what I think separates our aff preparation from many of our peers that I consider less successful on the aff. A lot of people are much better at impact selection, but good impacts are not as useful as intrinsic advantages because they are more easily defeated by counterplans. So the way this plays out is people get an intrinsic advantage and decide that the impact is not big enough or good enough, so they tack on an internal link to get to a bigger impact. I try to just make the intrinsic impact good or better. I think my method is much weaker against the status quo, but much, much better against counterplans. And in modern debate, counterplans are much more threatening than the status quo. The negative doesn't defend the status quo. Donald Trump is the president. You can prepare these extra internal link impacts. They're good add-ons if you think the neg is going to defend the status quo. But I think you need an intrinsic advantage that only your plan can solve. If you have to tack on an extra internal link chain, you have made what could have been a powerful advantage into a not very threatening one and easily counterplan-awayable. Point number 4, it's strong against the core critique or critiques. This is below the rest of those things because it's hard to design an affirmative that is just good against the critique in general. The kind of critique that I'm talking about here is the kind of critique that a flexible negative team would go for, not a case specialist team, unless the case specialist team read like a topic K as their case specialty. Against the case specialist, I think that's where you have a second version of your aff that lines up better with it. But against a team that could go for the process counterplan, could go for politics, could go for the case-specific counterplan in DA, but also could go for the critique, you have to make sure that your aff has a good angle against the critique that it is likely to be. The best affs are good against both. So on this topic, I think that is the set of critiques that I call liberal pacification. You might call them arms control or militarism, that set of arguments, Stavronakis, Cooper, etc. So you need an angle against that. Point number 5, it's strong against topicality. Unless you're intentionally trying to make the neg go for T, you need to be confident that you can win T. Even if you want the neg to go for T, you have to be confident you can win T. It doesn't matter that much what you think about whether your plan is topical. All that matters is what others think. And so while it is possible to defeat the common sense consensus, it takes a lot of effort and you have to be really good and you shouldn't count on that. On this topic, I think substantial is probably going to end up meaning a list of countries. And if you're on that list, I think you're going to be okay. And if you're off that list, I think you're going to be running against the grain and it's going to be an uphill battle. You might be okay with that, but you need to think about that. You need to think, do we really have a strong position against T? Point number 6, the last point. It is sustainably strong in all these areas. Sustainably strong in all these areas. Some affs have an angle, but it only works once or twice. Those affs can be useful, but they're only useful until the neg catches up, and then they suck. If you're going to go that route, you need to be vetting and producing affs much more frequently. So you have that first aff, and you've already kind of got one in the works that you're going to finish in a few weeks that's then going to plug in next. And then as soon as that one's there, there's already another one in the pipeline. The reason that I don't tend to like that is that realistically, you all can't do that with very few exceptions because the amount of work that requires is a lot, and the work that you do on one app doesn't help the other apps. And so a lot of people, college applications come up, school gets hard, you get stressed out or burned out, you just get tired, you get sick, and all of a sudden you're reading a bad app for 2 months or 3 months or 4 months. That's why I worry about choosing an app that's temporary. Roman numeral number 4, how to formalize the selection process. How to formalize the selection process. I have 5 suggestions. Number 1 is to create a formal vetting process. Formal. This can be done with yourself. Some of you are kind of your own team captain, team leader, student run. You can involve others. You should if you have others. Teammates. You can involve coaches. I mostly do this myself at Woodward, but I incorporate students, certain students, the students that are sort of the most experienced students, the student leaders. If you're doing it yourself, at least do it with your partner. If you have a coach, even a coach that doesn't really do a lot of art coaching, still incorporate them. Getting their feedback into this process is really useful. If you have alumni of your school that would be willing, incorporate them into the process. What you need are just some critical eyes that aren't your own that are going to take a look at your proposals and give you honest feedback. You want people that aren't afraid to tell you, I know that you really like this idea, but I don't think it's good, and here's why I don't think it's good. So it has to be people like that you trust. You don't want just a bunch of people who are like, oh yeah, great idea, sweet, let's go for it. As part of this, you should establish some deadlines and some expectations about how this process will work, and I'll give you some more things there. So point number 2, solicit and create proposals that include the following elements. Solvency advocate cards, at least one. Advantage internal link cards, so the key card that says what the advantage is, one or more. Cards that answer the core counterplans and the core DAs. T cards, and one or more drafts of the plan language. So that is, you have to have all of that, or for me, I'm not even going to think about your idea. I think your idea is a waste of my time. The way most of you come up with ideas is you're like, hey, I have an idea. Here's an article. No. I have an idea. This camp app looks cool. No. Find the solvency advocate card. Find the key advantage internal link card. Find the key card. It's only 1 or 2 cards that answer the core counterplan, that answer the core DA. find your T cards, can you prove your top goal, and draft the plan language. That's a proposal. Anything less than that is embarrassingly lazy. Point number 3, ruthlessly evaluate each of your proposals. Ruthlessly. Figure out what is the best negative argument, negative strategy against this aff. And then figure out, realistically, can we beat it? What are the vulnerabilities that this aff has? And importantly, what trade-offs do you have to accept if you read this aff? It can't be all things for everyone. There have been very few affs that I've ever written or coached. I'm trying to think if there are any. I think there are none, where there wasn't at least one significant trade-off that we had to accept in order to read that aff, even the affs that have been extremely successful. We had one team that didn't lose a prelim for an entire season, and who did not lose a policy debate about the plan. There was 3 aff debates the whole year: fiat, double bind, death K, some other K. So did not lose a policy, and we still had to accept trade-offs with that aff, and I'll tell you about that one later. It is important to be honest during this phase and to get other people's opinions. So point number 4, be a skeptic, not an advocate. Be a skeptic, not an advocate. The most common problem is that students get attached to an idea. They really want it to work, and so they talk themselves into thinking that it will work. And this ends in ruinous disappointment. You have to approach the aff selection process like your neg. You have to be assuming the best of the neg, not talking yourself into accepting that, the neg's not that smart. They're not going to point out that I don't have an intrinsic advantage. They're not going to understand that my 2AC card against the counterplan is not actually a 2AC card against the counterplan. They're not going to understand that I don't actually have a solvency advocate. They're not going to understand that my T cards don't actually match up with my plan. They're not going to catch up. I promise they'll catch up. So be skeptical. But point number 5, don't be a perfectionist. There is no such thing as a perfect aff. If you're a fan of The Good Place, Cheaty in The Good Place. Paralyzed anytime he has to make any decision, just completely incapacitated, choosing between 2 kinds of muffins, can't do it. A lot of students get into that spot when they're trying to pick an aff. I don't know what to decide. We will just never be aff. I will quit debate rather than make this decision about an aff. You have to be willing to accept trade-offs, and so you just have to decide. Done is better than perfect, especially when done enables you to get closer to perfect as you go. So don't be a perfectionist, and don't expect there to be an answer that will perfectly solve all problems. Roman numeral 5, how I've chosen affs on previous topics and what I think of those decisions in retrospect. So this will be my 10th year at Woodward. For brevity's sake, and because debate was a lot different, even 10 years ago, I've omitted affs from my pre-Woodward days, even though some of those were quite good. I will explain my thought process in reverse chronological order by topic. So last year, immigration. We read an aff about TPS and an aff about refugees. The counterplan we had to beat was the temporary counterplan. So we needed an intrinsic advantage to LPR, permanent immigration. TPS was not a camp aff. It was similar to the DREAM Act, which is something that we thought was going to be popular. We miscalculated. Its advantage, which was temporary bad, was extremely intrinsic and was an impact turn to the temporary counterplan. However, it was quite complicated, and so that was a factor. We felt confident in T. We slightly underestimated that. A lot of people went for T. That surprised me. We had way more T debates than I thought we'd have. But because it was so complicated and we had a diverse team, we decided we needed a simpler aff for the rest of the team. So refugees was a similar choice. It's a very big aff. It had a similar answer to the temporary counterplan. The TPS counterplan is what we thought people would say against the refugees counterplan. We thought about high skilled. Ultimately, we sort of made the decision not to read high skilled because that wasn't what we wanted to study. And in retrospect, maybe that was the wrong call. We didn't give the negative enough ground. That's one of my big lessons. Refugees was better. So the teams that read refugees got more debates where the neg went for something about refugees. But teams didn't often say something specific against TPS because it was too good and there was too little negative ground. High skilled, while less interesting, I think might have given us a better season because more negs seemed to go for specific arguments against high skill. So in retrospect, I'm not sure that we made the right decisions last year. But those were the things that we were thinking about. In particular, impact turning the temporary counterplan. We had the intrinsic advantage. So it was fascinating to watch other teams read completely unrelated affs, SIV affs, and they would just read our aff as the answer to the temporary counterplan. We skipped that and just read that as our aff. Second, the education topic, 2 years ago. We read the funding equity aff. That's it, all year. The counterplan to beat was the state's counterplan. So we needed an intrinsic advantage to federal level funding. Right to education was a popular camp aff. We slightly altered the mechanism. I can't even remember exactly when that happened. I think that might have even happened at camp. But mostly it was similar to a camp aff. We expected that the negative would go for the state's counterplan, and then the federalism disad, the spending disad, and the politics disad. We also thought that a big negative argument would be the school choice counterplan, and like school choice related disadvantage arguments. So we built an aff with an intrinsic educational equity advantage that impact turned federalism and school choice. We were also prepared to kind of critique and impact turn spending and politics. We did not have any topicality concerns. It seemed like it was the biggest aff and clearly topical. And we thought that it had the best angle against states. And I think it did. But we really underestimated how much the neg was going to rely on states anyway, especially because there was no topic DA. And so we overestimated the likelihood that federalism would be the topic DA. We overestimated how likely spending would be the DA. And so negs didn't actually read federalism that much, or spending that much, or school choice that much. And so it was a very frustrating year because most of the things the negative said were just complete nonsense. And so in retrospect, I really don't know what we could have done. That topic was just bad. It was a little broken because, of course, the neg is going to rely on the state's counterplan, but they needed a net benefit. And this was at a time when Donald Trump had become the president and the status quo sucked and there was no disad. And so I really don't know what we could have done differently. I think we did fine on the app, but that's how I thought about that year. Third, the China topic. We read a Taiwan app. The counterplan and DA to beat was pressure good, appeasement bad, containment good. We had choices. The topic said economic or diplomatic engagement. We chose diplomatic because economic asks were interesting, but we were worried about uniqueness. This was during Obama still. This was also during the election. We considered a few different diplomatic ones, but Taiwan was by far the biggest. So we identified a big disagreement in the literature, and we wanted to capitalize on that. Our affirmative gave the negative a ton of good ground. It was a camp aff. There were good camp negs, including one I produced here. There were really no topicality concerns at all, and this worked out really well. What ended up happening is that we just kept making the aff more and more extreme, more and more appeasing, to like convince the neg to keep going for containment and appeasement arguments, and we just got very good and very well prepared at defeating containment and appeasement arguments. And so that's the year where we lost only a handful of debates, and we didn't lose any debates to something that wasn't okay. The surveillance topic. We read a variety of affs on this topic. The DA to beat was terrorism. We read an aff about encryption. We read an aff about the Animal Something Terrorist Act that I forgot, AETA. We read an aff about SPOT, which is a program that the TSA uses. And then eventually we got around to a big aff about FISC reform. The counterplan we had to beat was executive self-restraint, and then it had a war powers element to it. Some affs tried to just perm that and dodge that. Some affs tried to dodge the terror DA. We thought that we were right about the terror DA, that the aff position about that was right, so we tried to choose affs that linked to it. We had a diverse team. We kind of allowed a lot of different affs to happen. In retrospect, that wasn't a great idea because the negative stopped reading the terrorism dissent, and in some spots our angle was too good. So in the middle of the year, we read FISC reform, which was just like a giant aff, the biggest aff on the topic. And that worked out well because it made the negative go for terrorism. At some point we started reading the link term terrorism advantage, or terrorism dissent as an advantage, which then made the negative debate terrorism again, which is what we wanted to debate. It became a very process counterplan based year, and so also a FISC reform aff was a very process oriented aff, so I think that went pretty well. Oceans. So the oceans topic sucked. It was a terrible topic. There were not really any core dissats. There was funding trade-offs, sort of. There weren't really any core counterplans even, because it was just a very strange set of things that were topical. You had to establish an ocean policy. So there was no core common ground between all affs, and so this one, we experimented with any affs. I didn't like any of them. I felt less prepared. I feel like our younger teams had bad debates. The aff that we stuck with the longest was comprehensive ocean planning, which we thought that was the biggest aff. It had a lot of advantages. It had a strong federal key argument, but it wasn't very rewarding. In retrospect, I don't know what I would have done differently. That was just kind of a bad topic, and so I'm frustrated. We did not make the right choice. I don't know if there was a right choice. Some teams read oil drilling. Maybe they had a better year. It seemed like the negative usually went for oil drilling related arguments against the oil drilling aff, so maybe that's what we should have done. Latin America. That was a very small topic. So Cuba, Venezuela, Mexico, you had to economically engage them. Almost everyone read the Cuba embargo aff. There were no Venezuela affs because at the time there was a power transition, and so it didn't make any sense to economically engage them. We were very bad that year. That was the rebuilding year for us. The counterplan that everyone had to beat was the QPQ counterplan. So instead of just doing economic engagement, get something in exchange for it, so trade something. We chose Mexico, and I was thinking about this as to make my notes, and I don't even really remember why. It seems clearly wrong. Cuba was the biggest aff, and we should have read that. Partway through the year, we did change to a Cuba travel ban aff, which was a slightly different version of the whole embargo aff. We just lifted the travel ban instead of the embargo. That was a pretty good aff. The reason that we selected that is that our students at that time were less experienced, and they weren't ready to debate the embargo. We should have, in retrospect, if I was coaching again and had this to do over, we would have read the embargo all year. But it had the right to travel. Cuba travel aff had an intrinsic advantage. It narrowed the debate. I do think the students learned something from it. But Cuban embargo was the right aff to read that year, and it was stupid that we did not do that. Transportation infrastructure had to beat the state's counterplan and privatization counterplan. It also had to beat stimulus bad arguments. So we just read a stimulus aff and got really good at that. We chose the aff that impact turned, the core negative generic. That was very successful. I think we made the right call there. It gave us an early season edge, especially because we also then would go for the core negative argument on the negative. So we were very well prepared and well informed about the core debate. We tweaked it throughout the year. We introduced some slightly new versions, but we kept the original aff mostly, and the students were pretty good because they had been learning about all of this all year. The negative eventually just stopped going for stimulus bad and the privatization stuff, and then the topic sucked. But it was still the right call. I think we chose the right one. Space, which is this year's college topic, that was an interesting one. The counterplan you had to beat was the international counterplan, so you needed an aff that had a United States key argument. And the DAs to beat were just anything short term. So politics and funding trade-off were the big ones. And the neg would just say, the DA happens way faster than space exploration, so you lose. We started the season reading what we thought were relatively short-term affs. So we did the James Webb Space Telescope, we did the Joint Polar Satellite System. We thought those were kind of relatively short-term, but we realized that those were also the most common trade-off scenarios, so we kind of just did an aff that was the trade-off DA. That we couldn't beat the short-term thing. So midway through the year, we pivoted to a Mars aff, colonize Mars. That had not been popular at camp because everyone thought it can't beat short-term disads. But we thought no aff could beat short-term disads unless we rethought it. So we wrote a Mars aff, and we just embraced the idea of short-term not mattering. And that's when we invented all this existential risk stuff that you all still use. So it was a much better aff, and we had a lot more success with it. We should have just done that from the beginning. We shouldn't have thought that we could outsmart the disad somehow. We should have just accepted that is the disad. Let's just fully attack the disad. Last one is military presence. That was my first year at Woodward Academy. And this was a list topic. So you had to reduce military presence in South Korea, Japan, Afghanistan, Kuwait, Iraq, or Turkey. And this was during a time when the Afghanistan war was robust. The Iraq war with the first, or whatever, one of the many withdrawals had kind of already happened. So the first three were big, South Korea, Japan, Afghanistan. The second three were very small, Kuwait, Iraq, Turkey. The counterplan and disad you had to beat was presence good, withdrawal bad, just like military presence good. And that included counterplans to do more presence. So the biggest and the most time-sensitive one of those countries was Afghanistan. This was in the middle of the Afghanistan war. So we read the biggest possible version of Afghanistan. We just withdrew from Afghanistan. And this was the right decision. We had a lot more success that season than we probably should have given our relative ability. The negative almost always went for case-specific arguments. It was great. That's one of my favorite topics. We just had a bunch of really good debates about Afghanistan all year. If we had chosen the Turkey aff, or if we had chosen the Iraq aff, one aff was change this post office, withdraw this post office from Iraq. If we had done that, we wouldn't have had a very good year. So I was pleased with that. All right, Roman numeral 6. What to do after you've decided your aff. What to do after you've decided your aff. I have 5 suggestions. Number 1, finish early and practice if possible. If possible. I say this, but I have a lot of trouble following this, and I don't really feel that bad about it. Because of how I feel about aff prep, I think it's really hard to get out ahead of the negative with your aff, because you really have to think through the negative. And you can't rush that or you're going to make the wrong call. So while we have finished affs early in the past, those are some of the ones that I have regretted. We finished that comprehensive ocean one early, and that didn't work. That wasn't very good. We finished some of those affs on the surveillance topic early, like that one about the animal terrorists. That aff was they label people terrorists who protest factory farms. There's a law, I forget what the acronym stands for, but we said that we should stop surveilling those people. And we wrote that, and it sounded cool in the abstract, but it created terrible debates, and it was just a dumb idea. But it was done early. And so in retrospect, those aren't so good. Some of the affs that we finished really late, like right before our very first turn, right before the Green Hill Round Robin, or whatever our first tournament is, some of those have been better because we really understood the topic at that point, and while we did have to flail a little bit at the beginning, we did fine because we were just right, and we had spent a lot of time thinking about the most important arguments, which is one of my next points. But that being said, of course, it's better to finish early in practice if you can. But remember, the first tournament is not the be-all, end-all. It's better to get a good aff and have made the right call and have really thought through the important questions than to just get something together early and practice at a time, because practicing a bad aff a lot doesn't really help you. Then you're going to have to change later. So I don't know. Everyone says finish early, but I don't always. And I think that's okay. Point number 2, write blocks to all the camp files, even the obscure ones. Most teams at the beginning of the year are very reliant on camp files. Don't just look at the major camps. Also look at the smaller ones, the ones that are harder to find. University of Texas, Gonzaga, Dartmouth. I guess those are kind of major, but Kansas, like any of the camps that aren't the ones that are the super mainstream, which really at this point is just Michigan. The other ones are the ones where you might not notice something and someone will just read a camp file and you just didn't even bother to look and then you weren't prepared. And a lot of times there's something really good at those camps. UTNF in particular. I don't know that we've ever had a student there, but they often have really good evidence, and they'll have files that people use. And I guess it's that we go to Green Hill for our first tournament, and so that's in Texas, so I assume many people from Texas go to the University of Texas camp. But we often will debate UTNIF, UTNIF I assume is how you say that, debate UTNIF arguments. Don't just say, as you're looking at stuff, we don't need a block to this because obviously it does not apply. People will think it applies, and they have to read it anyway, even if it doesn't, because that's what they have. So in the moment of the debate, you'll forget why you thought it didn't apply. So instead, write a short block, even just a paragraph of analytical text that just tells you why this doesn't apply. So that in the debate, yeah, this doesn't apply, and then you can kind of transform it into a block. You don't write a full block to something you don't think applies, but do explain at least why you don't think it applies. Point number 3, figure out what the most likely strategy will be against your aff by asking people. Ask people about their camp debates. Ask people about what has happened in debates they saw, what have they heard. You can kind of ask indirectly without revealing your aff, but honestly, I don't think there's actually that much benefit to cloaking your aff. So, especially if it's not radically new. So if you're just like, hey, at your camp, what was the big neg against Saudi Arabia? That's fine. If they're like, ooh, you're going to read Saudi Arabia, it's like, oh, okay. Good, I'm sure that it will help you prepare, because otherwise you wouldn't have had to prepare for Saudi Arabia. I guess if you were like, what would you say against, country Bulgaria? Maybe then it's like, oh, I should think about Bulgaria. But even then, who cares? Like, are they really going to dedicate a bunch of time to producing a Bulgarian egg? And the key is to get as many perspectives as you can, and especially this is important for topicality and counterplan. So how would you counterplan against your aff? What T arguments, if any, would you say? And ask some people that aren't in the bubble. So ask alums. Ask people that are former debaters, but that didn't go to camp. Ask college debaters that are willing to take the look. But especially people that are a little outside the debate bubble, people that debated 5 years ago and haven't really been in debate since then, those will give you unique perspectives that you can really take advantage of. Number 4, spend most of your time preparing to beat the right strategy or strategies. Most of your time preparing to beat the right strategy or strategy. It's of course important that you have something to say against all of the stuff the negative will say, at least something. But ultimately, the negative is going to win if they go for the right strategies. And if they don't, then you're fine. You're just going to be able to beat them. So you should identify what those are and then spend the vast majority of your prep time preparing to defeat those. If the best strategy against your aff is the leverage counterplan, or is the defense industrial base DA, or is whatever the specific country DA is, that's what you need to spend your time really improving your blocks, really improving your cards, doing some more research, and then practicing a lot. I would use frescoes to practice the end game. If you don't know what a fresco is, you can find that in the activities section of the SDI site, I think. It's something that we've come up with this summer to simulate late rebuttal endgame stuff. And I would do that on the essential counterplan and the essential DA, 1 or 2 counterplans, 1 or 2 DAs that are the essential arguments for your case. That way you can practice without doing full practice debates. Those are a waste of time. Point number 5, make sure you have a backup plan. Make sure you have a backup plan. You should keep a camp app around. So whatever you're prepping at camp, just keep that around, do a little update on it. Just make sure that you still remember it and it's organized and it could be read in an emergency. If you're a team that just has one aff, and especially if it's just you and your partner, this is really important. If you're a team with many affs on your squad, like your school, you have, you're a team where you have 20 debaters, 10 different teams, and there's 5 different affs. Make sure that at least one of the affs that somebody else is working on, you could read if you had to. The reason is that things change, and we've almost been burned by this many times, in my coaching career many times. Choosing a good aff often means that your aff is a good idea, and good ideas sometimes pass. I look back at the affs I've coached a while ago, which has now been 19 years, which is horrifying. And a very significant number of them have passed. And I think I kind of take pride in that, because it means that we are selecting affs that really could pass and that were passed. Some of them haven't, some of the better ideas haven't, because they were a little bit more radical. But especially if your aff is timely, and if your aff is a good idea, and your aff is not so unfathomably different than the status quo that it's just unthinkable, you need to have a backup plan. And you don't need to spend a ton of time on it, but if you're going to read Saudi Arabia, for example, you need to make sure you have a version where if Congress overrides Trump's veto, you still have an aff. If Trump just decides to end arms sales to Saudi Arabia, you still have an aff. And so I would suggest making your backup aff, if you have a country aff, something that is not country specific, something that is more thematic, like human rights risk assessment, like the code of conduct thing that Jason Peterson produced. Those are really good affs. Those might be the aff you select. Those are very good affs. But if you don't select one of those affs, I would make sure you have something like that as a backup plan. There is no chance that Thrall and Dormany's proposal or the code of conduct are going to get implemented before the season is over. But it is possible that arms sales to a particular country could end. The United States just kicked Turkey out of the F-35 program. It seems unlikely that Congress is going to override Trump's veto, but something could happen, something could change. So don't lock yourself into a spot where if that happens, you're completely screwed. So that's really all my secrets. I can't think of anything. I didn't intentionally hold anything back. I want you to choose good affs. I want you to think about this correctly. I want you to have affs that are very challenging to defeat. And so I hope that I've given you a framework for understanding the process. I hope that telling those stories, I didn't do that to brag or whatever. Most of it, I'm frustrated going back to those. But I think that'll help you understand. That's how I've done it. That's how we've decided. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. If you model some of that and make some improvements based on lessons I've learned in the ensuing 10 years since I've been at Woodward, I think you can choose a good aff, and I think you can have a successful season. What's more important than choosing your aff? Really nothing. I guess except enjoying debate. But I think choosing the right aff makes debate a lot more fun.